January 17th, 1942, Lyon. France. The frozen breath of a woman in a threadbare wool coat mingles with the morning fog rising off the Saône River. Her name is Marie-Madeleine, though to the Reich's counterintelligence officers hunting her, she is known only as Hérisson, the Hedgehog. Her gloved fingers, stiff with cold, clutch a leather satchel containing documents that could alter the course of the war. Inside, detailed German troop movements, U-boat coordinates, and coastal defense blueprints stretching from Brittany to the Spanish border. The streets of Lyon are silent except for the distant clatter of German patrol boots on cobblestone. She walks with the measured pace of someone who understands that survival depends not on speed, but on appearing ordinary. In occupied France, to be noticed is to die, but Marie-Madeleine Fourcade is anything but ordinary. She leads Alliance, one of the largest intelligence networks in occupied Europe. 3,000 agents spread across France, like invisible threads in a vast web, all reporting to a woman the Nazis believe cannot possibly exist. In the mind of the Gestapo, resistance networks are led by men, former military officers, communist organizers, hardened not a 32-year-old mother of two, who once worked as a publisher's assistant in Paris. This misconception is her greatest weapon. As she crosses the Pont Lafayette, her eyes scan for the milice, the French paramilitary collaborators whose cruelty often exceeds that of their German masters. The bridge is clear. She descends into the narrow streets of the old quarter, where centuries-old buildings lean together like conspirators, and slips into a bookshop whose owner died 3 months earlier. The shop remains open. It is maintained by ghosts in the back room. Past shelves of dusty volumes on botany and medieval history, a wireless radio operator waits. His name is irrelevant. In Alliance, names are luxuries reserved for peacetime. He is Mastiff, 47. She is Hérisson. The radio, a British-supplied mark to transceiver, is hidden inside a hollowed-out wardrobe. Its batteries are failing. They have perhaps 20 minutes of transmission, time before the Funke where the Wehrmacht's radio surveillance teams triangulate their position. She hands him the documents. He begins encoding at a feverish pace, translating reconnaissance into the 5-letter cipher groups that will be transmitted to London in bursts of Morse code. Outside, the city wakes. A baker opens his shutters. A streetcar rattles past, half empty. The occupation has made Lyon a city of shadows and silence, where trust is extinct and denunciation is currency. What the woman in the bookshop does not yet know is that across the English Channel, in the converted stable blocks of Bletchley Park and the oak-panelled offices of Broadway buildings in Westminster, her intelligence is considered among the most valuable coming out of occupied Europe. While the British Special Operations Executive plants explosives and the French resistance derails trains, Alliance provides something more subtle and more devastating: information. The coordinates of U-boat pens at Saône, the construction schedule for the Atlantic Wall, the movement patterns of panzer divisions regrouping after the Eastern Front. This is the silent war, the war of documents and radio waves, and it is being won by people like Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who risk everything not for glory. There is no glory in a war fought in shadows, but for the belief that tyranny, no matter how absolute it appears, contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. But to understand how a French woman came to command one of the most effective spy networks of the Second World War, we must turn back the clock 3 years to the summer of 1939, when Europe stood on the precipice and most believed that another great war could still be avoided. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade was born in 1909 in Shanghai, the daughter of a French shipping executive whose business took the family across Asia before settling in France. She grew up in a world of international intrigue, multilingual households, and the kind of cosmopolitan circles where politics and commerce intertwined. By the time she married Hérisson Fourcade, a French Air Force officer, She had developed a keen understanding of how information moved through networks, corporate, military, social. She was observant. She noticed things. When her marriage dissolved in the late 1930s, she found work in Paris with a publisher of military journals, a position that brought her into contact with officers, strategists, and the kind of men who spoke in hushed tones about Germany's rearmament and the inadequacy of the Maginot Line. One of these men was Georges Lustoner-Lukau, a maverick Air Force officer and fervent anti-communist who had spent the 1930s warning anyone who would listen that France was sleepwalking into catastrophe. Lustoner-Lukau was building something in secret, a network of informants, former soldiers, and patriotic civilians who could serve as the skeleton of a resistance movement should France fall. He called it the Riso Kleber, though it would later be renamed Alliance after the Gestapo discovered its original codename. He needed someone with intelligence, discretion, and the ability to coordinate complex logistics. He chose Marie-Madeleine. It was an unusual decision. In 1939, the French military establishment was deeply conservative, and the idea of entrusting strategic intelligence work to a woman was almost unthinkable. But Lustoner-Lukau recognized something in her, a clarity of purpose, an unflinching realism about what was coming. When he was arrested by Vichy authorities in 1941 for his resistance activities, leadership of the network fell to Marie-Madeleine by necessity. What began as a temporary arrangement became permanent. The network grew, it evolved, and it survived. By 1942, Alliance had become a hydra. Its agents were schoolteachers, priests, railway workers, fishermen, aristocrats, and prostitutes. They observed, they recorded, they transmitted. A dock worker in Lausanne would note the arrival of a new U-boat, identifying it by the number painted on its conning tower. A secretary in the Commandante in Paris would photograph troop deployment orders during her lunch break. A farmer in Normandy would count the number of concrete bunkers being poured along the coast, sketching their positions in the margins of his almanac. This information flowed upward through a hierarchy of cutouts and dead drops until it reached Marie-Madeleine, who synthesized it, encoded it, and passed it to London via wireless or courier. The British provided the radios, the money, and the occasional Lysander aircraft to evacuate compromised agents. Marie-Madeleine provided the courage. But courage, in occupied France, is measured not in moments of battlefield heroism, but in the slow accumulation of impossible decisions. Do you burn the list of agents when the Gestapo raids the safe house? Or do you try to flee with it, knowing that if you are caught, everyone on that list will die? Do you trust the new recruit who seems too eager, too well informed? Or do you turn him away and lose a valuable source? Do you continue transmitting, even though the Funkabware trucks are circling the neighborhood, their direction-finding antennas sweeping for your signal? These are the questions that defined Marie-Madeleine Fourcade's war. There were no right answers. There was only survival, and the hope that survival would last long enough to matter. The men and women of Alliance expected hardship. They expected danger. They expected the Gestapo, the milice, the torture cellars of Friends prison. What they did not expect, what no one who joined the resistance in the early years truly understood, was the sheer grinding exhaustion of living a double life. Every conversation was a minefield. Every stranger was a potential informant. The letters they received from family members were read by censors. Their homes were searched without warning. The cafes where they once met friends became places of danger. Paranoia was not a weakness. It was survival instinct. And beneath the paranoia was a deeper terror, the knowledge that betrayal could come from anywhere. A jealous neighbor, a spurned lover, a desperate parent trying to save their own child from deportation. In occupied France, loyalty was a luxury, and the Gestapo paid well. Yet what sustained these men and women, what kept Marie-Madeleine moving through the fog of Lyon and the back rooms of bookshops, and the endless train journeys to Marseille and Toulouse and Bordeaux was the belief that their work mattered, and it did, in ways they could not see, in ways that would only become clear after the war. The intelligence gathered by Alliance saved lives. When Allied bombers struck the U-boat pens at Saint-Nazaire in early 1943, they did so with targeting data provided by Alliance agents who had risked everything to photograph those installations. When the British Royal Navy intercepted German supply convoys in the Bay of Biscay, they did so using shipping schedules stolen from Kriegsmarine officers by secretaries who hid documents in their undergarments. When the Free French forces planned their assault on Corsica in 1943, they relied on coastal defense maps drawn by Alliance operatives who had walked every meter of shoreline, noting gun emplacements, minefields, and garrison strength. This was not the dramatic sabotage of bridges or the assassination of collaborators. It was quieter, slower, but it was devastatingly effective. The Americans, arriving late to the intelligence war in Europe, were astonished by what they found. The Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, had been operational for less than a year when it began coordinating with British intelligence and the Free French. OSS officers dispatched to London in 1942 expected to find amateurish resistance groups trading rumors and hoping for the best. Instead, they encountered networks like Alliance disciplined, hierarchical, equipped with sophisticated communication systems and penetration into the highest levels of Vichy and German administration. The OSS began funneling money, equipment, and training to Alliance. They provided high-frequency radios with longer range and better encryption. They supplied forged documents of extraordinary quality, German military passes, Ausweis identity cards, Gestapo credentials. They taught Alliance operatives advanced tradecraft, how to recognize surveillance, how to construct cover stories that could withstand interrogation, how to use invisible ink and microdots. But the most important thing the Americans provided was validation. For 2 years, the men and women of Alliance had operated in isolation, never certain if their reports were reaching London, never knowing if their sacrifices mattered. The arrival of American support confirmed that they were not alone, that they were part of something larger, that someone, somewhere, was listening. But collaboration with the Americans brought new dangers. The more successful Alliance became, the more determined the Gestapo was to destroy it. By mid-1942, the Germans had assigned an entire counterintelligence unit to hunting the network. They called it Unternehmen Eagle, Operation Hedgehog. They knew the network's code name. They knew its leader was called Hérisson, but they did not know that Hérisson was a woman. This single piece of misinformation bought Marie-Madeleine months of operational freedom. When the Gestapo arrested suspected resistance leaders, they rounded up men, former officers, politicians, intellectuals. They ignored the women standing beside them, assuming they were girlfriends, secretaries, couriers at best. This blindness was ideological. The Nazi worldview could not accommodate the idea of a woman commanding a strategic intelligence network. It offended their sense of natural order, and so they searched for a man who did not exist, while the woman they sought moved freely through their checkpoints, her papers in order, her demeanor calm, her satchel full of stolen secrets. But even misinformation has a half-life. In November 1942, the Gestapo captured a mid-level Alliance agent in Marseille. Under interrogation, the clinical term for what happened in the basement of the Hotel Terminus, where Klaus Barbie's men applied techniques refined in Poland and the Soviet Union, the agent broke. He gave them names, locations, radio frequencies. Within a week, the Gestapo rolled up a dozen agents. The network hemorrhaged. Safe houses were compromised. Radio operators vanished. Marie-Madeleine went underground, moving from town to town, sleeping in barns and abandoned factories, never staying more than 2 nights in one place. She lost weight. Her hair began to grey. Photographs from this period show a woman who appears a decade older than she is, her eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness and fear. But she did not stop. She rebuilt. She recruited new agents to replace those who had been arrested. She established new communication lines. She adapted, and then came the most audacious decision of her wartime career. In the spring of 1943, with the Gestapo closing in and the network on the verge of collapse, Marie-Madeleine decided to go to London herself. It was an insane risk. The journey required crossing into Spain, evading Franco's police, reaching Gibraltar, and then flying to England, a route that had claimed the lives of dozens of resistance operatives. If she were captured, the entire network would fall. Every agent, every contact, every safe house. But Marie-Madeleine understood that alliance needed more than radios and money. It needed strategic direction. It needed to coordinate its efforts with the coming Allied invasion of Europe. The operation that everyone knew was being planned, but no one dared speak of openly. She needed to meet with the planners, to show them maps, to explain what her network could do. So she went. The journey took 3 weeks. She crossed the Pyrenees on foot, guided by Basque smugglers who demanded gold coins that the OSS had provided. She spent 4 days hiding in a shepherd's hut, while Spanish border guards searched the valley below. She reached Madrid, where the British embassy provided false papers identifying her as a Canadian journalist. She flew from Gibraltar to England in the belly of a military transport plane, wedged between crates of ammunition, deafened by the roar of engines, freezing in the unheated cargo hold. When she arrived in London in June 1943, she had been awake for 36 hours. Her clothes were filthy. Her hands were blistered from the mountain crossing. She looked, one British intelligence officer later recalled, like a ghost. But she carried with her the most comprehensive intelligence on German coastal defences in France that the Allies had yet seen. The meetings in London were revelatory. For the first time, Marie-Madeleine saw the scale of what was being planned. Overlord Neptune, the liberation of Europe. She met with British MI6 officers, American OSS planners, Free French intelligence chiefs. She spread her maps across tables in the war rooms beneath Whitehall and explained, point by point, what Alliance knew. The location of every radar installation between Cherbourg and Calais, the strength and morale of German garrison units, the condition of roads and bridges, the sympathies of local mayors and police chiefs. She spoke for hours, her voice hoarse, her hands gesturing at the maps, tracing routes and marking positions. The officers listened in silence. When she finished, one of them, an American colonel whose name she never learned, stood and said simply, "If we'd had this a year ago, we'd have saved 10,000 lives." It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact. But validation came with a cost. The British and Americans insisted that Marie-Madeleine remain in London. It was too dangerous, they argued, for her to return to France. Alliance needed her alive, not dead in a Gestapo cell. She refused. Her network was collapsing. Her agents were being hunted. If she did not return, if she abandoned them, Alliance would cease to exist. The argument lasted for days. Finally, a compromise was reached. She would return, but only after the Allies had established a secure communication line and provided additional resources. She would not go alone. The British would send a trained operative with her, an SOE agent who could serve as bodyguard, radio operator, and liaison. His name was Henry Schara, though in the field he would be known as Griffin. He was 28 years old, a veteran of the Norwegian campaign, fluent in French and German, and one of the few men Marie-Madeleine ever trusted completely. They parachuted into France on a moonless night in August 1943, landing in a meadow near the village of Ussel in the Karazi region. The reception committee, 3 Alliance agents armed with British Sten guns guided them to a farmhouse where they burned their parachutes and changed into civilian clothes. Marie-Madeleine was back. The network, battered but unbroken, began to regenerate. New agents were recruited. New radio operators were trained. The flow of intelligence resumed. But the war was entering its final, most brutal phase. The Gestapo had learned from its failures. It had infiltrated other resistance networks using double agents and turned operatives. It had refined its interrogation methods. It had become patient, willing to watch and wait rather than strike immediately. The hunt for Hérisson intensified. In October 1943, Marie-Madeleine narrowly escaped capture in Paris. A Gestapo unit raided the apartment where she was meeting with an agent. But she fled through a back window, dropping 2 stories into an alley and sprinting through the streets until she lost her pursuers in the warrant of Montmartre. In December, she was betrayed by a double agent who had infiltrated the network 6 months earlier. She was arrested in Lyon, handcuffed, and taken to a Gestapo holding facility. It should have been the end. But Marie-Madeleine Fourcade possessed a singular talent for survival. That night, in the cell where she was being held, she removed all her clothing, greased her body with soap, and squeezed through a barred window barely 20 centimeters wide. Naked, in the middle of winter, she crawled across the rooftop, climbed down a drainpipe, and disappeared into the frozen streets. A nun found her hours later, hypothermic and delirious, and hid her in a convent. It took her 3 weeks to recover. The Gestapo never learned how she escaped. They assumed she had help from the inside. The truth that she had dislocated her own shoulder to fit through a window seemed too improbable. By the spring of 1944, the invasion was imminent. Alliance, reduced but resilient, threw everything it had into preparing the ground. Agents marked drop zones for paratroopers. They cut telephone lines. They sabotaged fuel depots. They provided real-time intelligence on German troop movements as panzer divisions raced toward the Normandy coast. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Marie-Madeleine listened to the BBC broadcast the coded messages that signaled the invasion. She sat in a borrowed kitchen in a village whose name she never recorded, her head in her hands, weeping with relief and exhaustion. It had been 5 years. 5 years of fear and loss and impossible choices. And now, finally, the tide was turning. But the war was not over. As the Allies pushed inland, the Gestapo launched a final, desperate campaign to annihilate the resistance. Alliance lost more agents in the summer of 1944 than in any other period of the war. They were hunted in the streets, dragged from their homes, executed in ditches. Marie-Madeleine kept moving, kept transmitting, kept rebuilding. She was operating on instinct now, beyond exhaustion, driven by something deeper than courageous refusal to let the work be unfinished. By the time Paris was liberated in August 1944, Alliance had been reduced to a few hundred operatives. But it had survived, and its contribution to victory was undeniable after the liberation. When the accounting was done, historians and military analysts attempted to quantify what Alliance had achieved. The numbers are staggering. Over the course of the war, the network transmitted more than 3,000 intelligence reports to London. It identified 1,800 German military installations. It provided targeting data for hundreds of Allied bombing raids. It saved an estimated 400 downed Allied airmen, smuggling them out of occupied territory through escape lines that stretched from the Netherlands to Spain. 144 Alliance agents were arrested by the Gestapo. 58 were executed or died under torture. 36 were deported to concentration camps, where most perished. Marie-Madeleine survived. She was awarded the Croix de Guerre, the Médaille de la Résistance, and the British Order of the British Empire. The Americans gave her the Medal of Freedom. But the honors felt hollow. The war had taken everything from her friends, comrades, years of her life. And it had taken something less tangible, but perhaps more important: the belief that the world was capable of learning from its mistakes. There is a small museum in the village of Aix-en-Provence, dedicated to the memory of Alliance. On its walls hang photographs of the agents, grainy black and white images of men and women in their 20s and 30s, their faces serious and unsmiling. There are maps marked with the locations of safe houses, radio transmitters, drop zones. There are forged documents, identity cards with false names and smudged stamps. And in a glass case in the center of the room, there is a leather satchel, cracked with age. The same satchel Marie-Madeleine carried across the Pont Lafayette in January 1942. It is empty now. But once, it held the coordinates of U-boats, and the blueprints of bunkers, and the names of agents willing to risk everything for a future they would not live to see. The story of Marie-Madeleine Fourcade is not a story of superhuman heroism. It is a story of ordinary people confronted with an extraordinary evil, and the choice they made to resist. She was not invincible. She was terrified, constantly, and with good reason. She made mistakes. She trusted people she should not have trusted. She survived through luck as much as skill. But she kept going, and that persistence, that refusal to accept the permanence of tyrannies, what ultimately mattered. The intelligence she gathered did not win the war by itself. No single network, no single agent, no single act of sabotage could do that. But it contributed. It was part of the vast, grinding machinery of resistance that made occupation unbearable for the occupiers. That forced the Wehrmacht to divert resources to counterintelligence. That provided the Allies with the information they needed to strike with precision rather than brute force. And in doing so, it saved lives. The Americans who supported Alliance learned something profound from the experience. They learned that effective resistance is not born from ideology alone, but from networks of trust built over years. They learned that intelligence gathering requires patience, discipline, and an acceptance of risk that cannot be taught in training schools. They learned that the people best suited for clandestine work are often not the soldiers or the spies, but the ordinary citizens who understand the rhythms of daily life and can move through occupied territory without attracting notice. These lessons shaped the OSS, and later the CIA, in ways that are still felt today. The networks of informants that American intelligence would build in Korea, Vietnam, and the Middle East all trace their lineage back to the partnerships forged in occupied France. And at the center of that lineage stands a woman who crossed a bridge in Lyon on a frozen morning in 1942, carrying a satchel full of secrets, believing that information could be a weapon as deadly as any bomb. When the war ended, Marie-Madeleine tried to return to normal life. She remarried. She wrote her memoirs, a book titled Noah's Ark, named after the animal code names Alliance agents used to identify themselves. She gave lectures. She attended commemorations. But she never fully left the war behind. How could she? The people she had known, the friends who had died, the decisions she had made, they stayed with her. In interviews conducted decades later, she spoke with a kind of weary clarity about what the war had cost. "We believed we were fighting for France," she said in a 1989 interview 3 years before her death. "But we were fighting for something larger than France. We were fighting for the idea that people have the right to live free from terror." That might sound abstract now, but in 1942 it was not abstract. It was the only thing that mattered, and that, perhaps, is the true legacy of Marie-Madeleine Fourcade and Alliance. Not the medals, not the statistics, not the intelligence reports filed in archives in London and Washington, but the reminder that resistance to tyranny is possible, that ordinary people, equipped with nothing more than courage and a belief in something beyond themselves, can alter the course of history. That information truth documented and shared, is a form of power that no amount of military force can entirely suppress. The Nazis controlled the cities, the roads, the radio stations, the newspapers, but they could not control what people knew. They could not prevent a dock worker from counting you, or a secretary from photographing troop orders, or a woman from crossing a bridge in the fog, carrying secrets that would help bring an empire to its knees. In the end, the satchel is what remains. Empty now, displayed in a glass case, illuminated by soft museum lighting. But once, it was full of maps and coordinates, and the handwritten notes of agents who believed that their observations mattered, that their work, invisible and unrecognized, was helping to build a future where such work would no longer be necessary. They were wrong about that, of course. The world did not become safer. New tyrannies arose. New wars demanded new acts of resistance. But the principle endured. That freedom is not a gift bestowed by the powerful, but a right defended by the courageous. That the fight against oppression is never finished, because oppression adapts and evolves. And that the weapon against it is not always force, but knowledge. The simple, relentless accumulation of truth, passed hand to hand through networks of trust, until it reaches the people who can use it to change the world. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade understood this. She lived it, and in doing so, she became a symbol of something larger than herself, reminder that in the darkest moments of history, when the machinery of totalitarianism seems unstoppable, there are always people willing to stand in its path, not because they are fearless, but because they understand that some things are worth the risk. The satchel, empty now, once held the future, and the woman who carried it, across bridges and through cities and over mountains, carried it not for glory, but for the belief that on the other side of fear and suffering, there was a world worth fighting for. That belief, fragile and tested and battered by loss, was enough. It had to be, because in the war of shadows, belief was the only weapon that could not be taken away.